Good afternoon and welcome to the Carr Center for Human Rights Policies webinar today. I'm Sushma Raman, the Executive Director. I apologize for the slightly delayed start due to technical difficulties. Before I welcome our distinguished speaker and our audience members, I wanted to just start with a few words about the Carr Center and our work. We serve as the hub for the Kennedy School's teaching, research, and training in the human rights domain. We currently have three major research priorities: technology and human rights, led by our faculty director, Matthias Riese, which examines the ethical and rights implications of technological advancements. We conduct research, host a fellows program, and convene stakeholders around topics such as surveillance, facial recognition technology, algorithmic bias, and the right to be forgotten. Our second major research project is called Renewing Rights and Responsibilities in the United States, led by senior fellow John Shattuck. This project examines the rights and responsibilities that define the relationship of people to the government and each other. And we are working on a policy blueprint around 6 themes related to rights renewal, including democratic process, equal opportunity, freedoms of expression and religion, privacy, due process of law, and sustainability and economic rights. And finally, our third major research project is a newly launched Nonviolent Action Lab led by Erica Chenoweth. This lab produces and disseminates knowledge on nonviolent action, how it works, and global trends. We're also home for a range of special initiatives and programming on a range of human rights concerns. And more recently, the center has created a more explicit focus on the impact of the pandemic on a range of human rights and on racial justice and equity in the aftermath of the George Floyd killing and the ensuing protests. This webinar series aims to shine a spotlight on a range of scholars, activists, practitioners, and policymakers to lift up diverse perspectives and approaches. And today it's my honor to welcome and introduce Alan Jenkins, who I've known for almost 2 decades when we were both at the Ford Foundation. Alan is a professor of practice at the Harvard Law School, where he teaches classes on race and the law, communications, and social justice. Before joining Harvard Law School, he was president and co-founder of Opportunity Agenda, a social justice communications lab dedicated to the idea that our nation can and should be a place where everyone enjoys their full and equal opportunity. His prior positions include Director of Human Rights at the Ford Foundation, where he managed grant making in the United States and 11 overseas regions, Assistant to the Solicitor General of the US Department of Justice, and Associate Counsel to the NAACP Legal Defense and Educational Fund. He previously served as a law clerk to US Supreme Court Justice Harry A. Blackmun and US District Court Judge Robert L. Carter. According to Alan, it's time for a third reconstruction, a fundamental reconsideration of our constitutions, systems, institutions, and practices to uphold human rights and ensure equal opportunity for all. Alan, I'd love for you to start by sharing your reflections on this theme of a third reconstruction and how we can reimagine systems and institutions. We'll then have a conversation, and we would love to hear from members of our audience with their questions and comments. I'll turn it over to you, Alan.
Thanks so much, Sushma. I think part of where that comes from is we're hearing again and again from folks, including some of us who are veterans in the civil rights and human rights struggle, that as Americans of different ages and races take to the streets to protest the police killing of George Floyd, of Breonna Taylor, of so many unarmed people of color, people are saying, you know, it feels different this time. And it does feel different. And so a number of us have been thinking about, well, what might that mean and what could it mean for our country? And as you noted, one of the things that I believe and I hope it will mean is that this is the start of a third reconstruction in our nation, one that is rooted in human rights and the notions of equal dignity and equal justice and a new sense of belonging. A reconstruction to me is a fundamental reconsideration as a nation of who we are, who is part of the us, what do we stand for, and for that to be embedded in our understanding of what our Constitution is, our laws and policies, but also the way we treat each other. So for those viewers who are not familiar with US history, the First Reconstruction, which is really the formal Reconstruction in our nation, took place after the cataclysmic events of the Civil War, the assassination of President Lincoln, the Black Codes, which sought to re-enslave recently freed African Americans and others. And it had a number of different elements, many of which were truly transformative. So it was out of those cataclysmic events and out of the leadership and activism of that time, beginning in roughly 1865 and lasting till about 1877, we saw the adoption of the 13th Amendment to the US Constitution, which outlaws slavery, except in the case of people convicted in the criminal justice system. We'll return to that. Of the 14th Amendment, which provides equal protection under the law and due process, and included a privileges and immunities clause that was intended to make all of us full citizens of the United States with all of the privileges and immunities that entails. It included the 15th Amendment to the Constitution, which guaranteed the right to vote to men, irrespective of race, and was intended to enfranchise within the meaning, the patriarchal meaning of the franchise at that time, African-American men. But it also included a raft of new civil rights laws providing equal access in the jury room, in the courthouse, in public accommodations, in housing and contracts and the like. And importantly, which many people forget, it involved the sending of federal troops to the South to enforce the rights of these recently emancipated people. It included a Freedmen's Bureau, which was intended to assist people making the transition from slavery into freedom, but also was intended to assist other African Americans and other folks in the wake of the Civil War. It was transformative in many ways, but it was also limited and it was short-lived. It was limited in significant part because President Johnson, Andrew Johnson, who had become president in the wake of Lincoln's assassination, was a white supremacist and was staunchly opposed to the Reconstruction enterprise and vetoed many civil rights laws, some of which were passed over his veto. It was also limited because the US Supreme Court at that time was hostile to fully recognizing the rights of all people irrespective of race. And so they began throwing obstacle after obstacle in front of this notion of true equal justice under the law. For example, they held that the 14th Amendment and the laws passed thereunder could only reach governmental discrimination, not private discrimination in public accommodations or transportation or any of those other aspects of daily life. And there were a number of other ways in which they limited the power of those new laws in the Constitution. And more importantly, by 1877, in the Compromise of 1877, federal troops were removed from the South by Republicans in order to claim the presidency of Hayes. And with the removal of federal troops from the South, Reconstruction ended. At that time, there were significant numbers of African Americans who had been elected to the US Congress and to state legislatures in states like South Carolina and Louisiana for the first time. They had passed very progressive and inclusive laws, that some of which were the precursors to safety net protections that we would later see. All of that was wiped away in what would follow almost a century of the rise of Jim Crow, segregation, of terror on the part coming from the Ku Klux Klan, but also from sheriffs and law enforcement and everyday citizens, white citizens in the South, and a long, difficult period of the end of slavery, a brief taste of true freedom and equality, and then 100 years of suppression and repression. About 100 years later, from roughly 1945 until roughly 1965, is what historians and people who've studied the period often call the Second Reconstruction. And so this is, characterized especially by the civil rights movement, led by people like Martin Luther King Jr. and Ella Baker and others, but also began, importantly, with the creation of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948 and the creation of the international human rights regime. This second Reconstruction, which I'll talk about briefly, came itself out of the cataclysmic events of the Great Depression, which was followed by World War II, the horrors of the Holocaust, and by significantly Black veterans coming home from World War II, being hailed rhetorically as heroes, expecting things to have changed, and then finding the same brutal segregation and repression that had been present in the South, but also in many other parts of the country before they left. They came back expecting more and ultimately demanding more. And that was one of the events that really sparked this second Reconstruction, which included the civil rights movement, which of course moved hearts and minds as well as policy through significant sacrifice and bloodshed and courageous leadership. It resulted in a whole new set of civil rights laws, particularly the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which we just this week saw the US Supreme Court use to find that discrimination against gay and transgender Americans in employment is unlawful. Those laws were passed in the mid-1960s, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which was a sea change. And excuse me, the US Supreme Court making a shift, in part because President Roosevelt had nominated and had confirmed so many more progressive, or at least open, Supreme Court justices, to move from, for example, considering racial segregation to be equality under the Constitution, to the Brown versus Board of Education decision, finding that separate can never be equal, and outlawing governmental segregation and discrimination, at least by explicit law. A real kind of revolution of rights, in which, among other things, the US Supreme Court used the 14th Amendment to find that the full Bill of Rights, from the first to the 10th amendments to our Constitution, applied fully to states and municipalities, which had not been the case before that revolution of that second Reconstruction. And so First Amendment, freedom of speech protections, due process, protections against abuses by law enforcement, unreasonable searches and seizures, all of which had not been fully applicable to states or localities, local police departments and the like, became applicable. That revolution, that Reconstruction, however, also came to an end. And most people believe that it came to an end roughly in 1968, when President Nixon ran on what he called a Southern strategy of intentionally stoking racial division and white supremacy to turn the South from a set of progressive Republicans and often white supremacist Democrats to the white supremacists and many, many others shifting to elect President Nixon. He ran also on a law and order campaign. And so we see the beginning of the so-called war on drugs, which resulted in the mass incarceration of many, many millions of people of color. We later learned intentionally aimed at controlling and suppressing communities of color. President Nixon began appointing justices to the Supreme Court and the federal courts who were openly hostile to civil rights. A few good ones got through, like Harry Blackmun, who I worked for, but for the most part, you see a shift in using the courts to suppress civil rights, and we're still living with the implications of that today. Subsequent presidents latched onto that strategy and have utilized it. You find that this is an era in which the Supreme Court begins again to put obstacles in the way of the vindication of equal protection of the laws. So for example, holding that only laws that can be proven to be intentionally discriminatory, intended to harm people of color, are unlawful under the Equal Protection Clause, an almost impossible burden to meet and really ill-fitted to the way in which discrimination and segregation take place. decisions giving police more and more power, creating really out of whole cloth the idea of immunity from suit for police officers, some police officers who violate the Constitution. That's something that's being hotly debated right now. So again, you saw a wave of transformative change, which really has helped to change our nation for the better, but that was brought to an abrupt halt due to backlash. I should note that other things that happened in that second Reconstruction include removing some of the most racist barriers to immigration for non-white immigrants to our country, which has resulted in significant, vibrant democracy in our nation, or vibrant population of diverse folks in our country. A beginning, a window into acknowledging and addressing the attempted genocide of indigenous peoples in our country and the destruction of both culture and sovereignty, and a modest restoration of that sovereignty and recognition of what was done wrong. Many of those things also ground to a halt in that subsequent period. So that's the history. Why do I think briefly that this may be a moment for a third Reconstruction, and one that perhaps is more sustainable? These past transformative events, as I noted, have come from the combination of cataclysmic events in our nation, hard lessons learned, leadership, and a road forward to really fundamentally revisit our values, our institutions, our Constitution, who belongs to our society. I think that I hear, and I'm a student of public opinion, more and more people ready to fundamentally question some of those underpinnings, or more properly, to bring us to the highest values that were expressed but never fulfilled in our Constitution, of equal justice under law, of due process, of e pluribus unum, from many different people and states one. On the one hand, there's some real challenges to that. Right? So where we've seen the most successful attempts at Reconstruction, you have some combination of Congress, courts, president, who were at least open to that kind of transformative change. And we really don't have that at this moment in time. It's also true, however, that none of those prior reconstructions began in a moment of openness. That openness was driven by experience and leadership and organizing and activism and trial and error. And it's also the case that this is the first time that we've had a nation that is almost 40% people of color, 14% immigrants, in which we all have social media and can communicate and organize in completely different ways, in which we have a sophisticated organizing infrastructure. The 21st century is really thus far, a century of social movements, of Black Lives Matter and the Dreamers and Me Too and Time's Up and Occupy Wall Street and the Tea Party on the right, in which everyday people are beginning to reclaim the democratic debate in important ways. Things could go either way, for sure. We've seen modest reform followed by retrenchment, but we have also seen our nation take a giant leap in the past towards greater equality and human rights for all. So I do want to talk about what I see as some of the underpinnings of a potential third Reconstruction, but let me stop talking briefly and Sushma, let you take the conversation wherever would be most helpful.
Actually, my first question for you, not planned, was to say, what are some of the kind of core components of a third Reconstruction? And how much of this needs to be grounded in law and policy versus in creating and framing new narratives and changing norms and values and culture?
Well, I think just to address the second part of your question first, they're all connected, right? Culture and law, policy and practice are all interwoven. And we've seen that in these past movements and steps forward. An interesting note that I've heard, I believe it's historically accurate, is that the United States, the term, was a plural until the Civil War and Reconstruction era, when it became singular. So in other words, people would say the United States are, and after this period, they would say the United States is. A reconception of who we are as a nation in some important ways. We see that, exponentially to be the case during the Second Reconstruction and the Civil Rights Movement, in which the way we think about ourselves and talk about ourselves, the kind of framers, if you will, Martin Luther King Jr.'s "I Have a Dream" speech, for example, being one of the defining ways in which we think and talk about ourselves as a nation, even though we rarely fully live up to that. So I believe they're all interwoven, but Constitution and laws are crucial, because that's how new understandings get implemented and enforced, and they're what makes it lasting, right? So when the current moment has subsided, we need to make sure that our society and our institutions have been changed in some lasting ways that will outlive the current enthusiasm for change. And that's certainly something that we saw with the first and second reconstructions, where we're still, although we have never fully achieved them, we're still enjoying some of the benefits, the rights, the understandings that emerged from those earlier periods. But what I hope will be at the core of a third reconstruction, number one, a debate and discussion and engagement amongst everyday Americans. And so some of those themes need to come from that process, and particularly from the people who are most affected by some of the challenges that we're facing today. Importantly for me would be a full embrace of the international human rights that we as the United States helped to craft over 70 years ago. The United States played a crucial role in the Universal Declaration and in the international human rights regime. Eleanor Roosevelt, but also civil rights leaders of that time who played a crucial role. But then the United States immediately began to distance itself from implementation of so many of those human rights, and to really brand economic, social, and cultural rights as socialist or communist in the Cold War era, and right up to today. So I think we need to return to embrace those rights that we helped to craft. So let's think concretely. For example, we hear the current call, defund the police, or what I consider to be fundamentally re-envisioning what public safety and justice mean in our country in ways that are completely different from what we've gone about in the past. And part of which, meaning our policing systems, are fundamentally bound up with white supremacy and discrimination. Generations before anyone who's currently a police officer, many of these systems were designed precisely to control Black and brown people and to deny equal justice and equal voice. So what if, for example, for myself, if a family member of mine had a mental health crisis, for example, it wouldn't occur to me to dial 911 because I would be afraid that that would result in that person's death or incarceration or violence towards them. Similarly, if I had a neighbor of color or a transgender neighbor or an immigrant neighbor who was having a loud party or even a domestic dispute, I would be very reluctant to pick up the phone and call 911 because it might result in their deportation or death or violence. But what if calling 911 meant fetching mental health professionals? What if it meant bringing mediators or restorative justice experts or problem solvers? What if we were investing in the front end in health and opportunity in ways that meant there would almost never be a need to pick up the phone and call for immediate intervention because we were focusing on prevention and shared health? And I think that our human rights system provides a lot of guidance there. So for example, as I noted, whereas the US Supreme Court has held that you have to prove intentional discrimination in order to invalidate a policy that is discriminatory in practice, and that's almost impossible, the Convention on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination does not. it looks to outcomes. Third looks to discriminatory outcomes and seeks alternatives. Think of how many of our current criminal justice systems would no longer be viable, would no longer be lawful or in use if we were to use that standard for exploring them. That has been one of the main obstacles to challenging discriminatory criminal justice systems in the federal courts in the United States. Think about the, in the Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, the guarantee of the highest attainable standard of physical and mental health for all people, if we were to embrace that. So the United States has not ratified the covenant, but it is part of our international laws. And what if we were to embrace that? How might that make, again, traditional policing irrelevant? If we knew that there were professionals who we could call at any moment, the same way we can call the police, to come help intervene in a positive way in a situation. So I think that's one of the pillars. It is by no means all of what we need in order to have a sea change, a transformative vision for policing, for example. Hopefully we'll get a chance to talk about higher education as well, where you and I sit. But I think that those are some fundamental pillars. And by the way, they're profoundly American or US oriented. Our leadership was crucial in developing them. When you think about economic, social, and cultural rights, not only are they in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which the US helped to craft, but they really were, many of them derived from Franklin Delano Roosevelt's second Bill of Rights, which was laid the groundwork for our social safety net system that was added to in the Second Reconstruction by Lyndon Johnson's War on Poverty and Great Society programs. So, I think we need to be thinking about those pillars that are tied to our history and our culture, but that have never been fully realized or even attempted in our country, and the full embrace of which would be transformative. They would force us to change and revisit how we work, how we do business, how we treat each other, what our Constitution and laws mean, and how that plays out in our institutions and in our communities.
Thank you. So of course, the institutions and systems we're concerned about transcend just criminal justice. But if we remain in that domain for right now, there have been calls to defund the police. And then there have been also others who have said we need to do specific things, right? Like maybe more incremental reforms that can have a chance of being passed. And, people have questioned the use of chokeholds, qualified immunity for police officers. So if you were to say reimagining the police involves this, you've laid out a landscape that involves financial support and investments in mental health, education, immigration, all of these systems that provide for, a flourishing of the human life. But how would you practically go about it, right? So given that there's 18,000 police departments around the country, decisions are made from sort of the local to the municipal, to the state, to the federal level. So how would you approach this in a sort of a more tangible way to reimagine criminal justice? And would you also include other issues that perhaps we're not touching on in today's conversations around police brutality, but are integrally tied to Black life, such as the use of the death penalty, the whole problems with bail and what that means for people who are, incarcerated while they are awaiting the pretrial detention conditions. So just help us map out, how would we do this in a more tangible way?
Sure. I think that the kind of transformative change that I'm labeling a third reconstruction, it's going to be federal, it's going to be state, it's going to be tribal, it's going to be localized, it's going to be in private institutions. And, I think we've seen that, right? The civil rights movement, for example, made significant progress in that respect. And I think we need to work together. For each of those entities, there are important things that can be done right away. I'm in favor of eliminating qualified immunity for police officers, but I think it would be a huge missed opportunity if we don't simultaneously reinvent the whole idea of public safety. And I think, I think you can do both of those things. I think it's important to make sure that the end goal is transformative change and that everything we do is moving in that direction. So just to answer your question more practically, Sushma, for example, the federal government provides huge amounts of money to local police departments and municipalities. And it has occasionally, you saw a bit of this during the Obama administration, a bit of it during the Carter and significant activity during the Johnson administration, to put some limitations and some instruction on how that money can be used, right? So, for instance, no militarized weapons. And if police departments that go in that direction, that's one way to defund at the federal level, to say we are not going to provide any federal funds to a municipality that engages in those kinds of tactics. Simultaneously, and I'm talking about the federal government now, here's what we will do for those municipalities that want to fundamentally reinvent what public safety and public health and opportunity means. Here are the resources, financial, expertise. Here's how we're going to help to look at best practices. You see some municipalities, some cities and towns in our country, in the US now, shifting funds away from police departments. Los Angeles has done it. Minneapolis is asking tough questions. Let's look at what's working in the US and in other places, and also not be afraid to envision what things could look like. How could we create, in the same way that the federal government helped to create the Peace Corps and Legal Services Corporation to make sure that low-income folks had lawyers in civil situations that could result in homelessness or other things. How could we invest in ensuring that there are public health professionals, drug treatment professionals, problem solvers, restorative justice practitioners in every community that needs them? And at the same time, we need to be working in our communities, in our institutions, to ask those same tough questions. In my community in New Jersey, my daughter is analyzing the budget of our medium-sized, I guess we're a small city or a large town, and asking tough questions about why is so much money going towards the police department when we have so little money going towards mental health protection. It's within all of our power to ask those questions. We also have to then press for answers, act on the answers, vote in a way, both local as well as state, tribal, and federal, in a way that reinforces those best practices that lead to equal justice and public health. It's not an easy thing to do, but I think this is the moment to do it. And one of the reasons why I think that is because we're seeing a confluence of cataclysmic, terrible events and new opportunities and openness. Certainly, certainly the killings of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and so many others that have people out in the streets. Also the COVID-19 crisis, the pandemic, where we see it has laid bare the racially discriminatory and unequal health system that we have, which is inadequate for almost all of us, but also discriminatory in its effects. We're seeing that workers of color are most likely, and communities of color are most harshly affected, in part because so many people of color are caregivers and healthcare professionals and the like, but also because there's less ability to social distance and the like. And so, those things are coming together in ways that I think are causing people to call for something fundamentally different. So, incremental change is important. Most transformative change is the result of lots and lots of incremental change coming together. But I think we have to make sure that part of our goal is to fundamentally reinvent some of these institutions and to never let incremental change be the enemy or the obstacle to transformative change.
Thank you. So before I turn to my next question, I wanted to actually make an observation, which is that, you hearken to the importance of the international human rights framework and its relevance in the United States today. And I'm just thinking back on our work at the Ford Foundation 20 years ago, where groups around the world, grassroots organizations and leaders were really using budget accountability as a tool to ensure
Sushma, I lost your audio.
I'm sorry?
Okay, I lost your audio for a moment, but you're back.
Oh, sorry. I was just saying that, 20 years ago, we were working with grassroots groups around the world at the Ford Foundation, where we supported groups working on budget accountability, where groups were using these very tools to ensure the provision of economic goods for low-income communities. So I do think that we have things that we can learn from the rest of the world, because social movements around the world have been working on these issues for many decades now. So anyway, coming back to some of the questions from the audience, one question is, does this level of macro change require political reconstruction, such as abolition of the Electoral College or to expand the Congress?
Well, I do think that part of what would be needed for fully transformational change would be revisiting our Constitution and laws. But I also think that many of the frameworks that we already have in place, if we took them seriously, would get us most of the way towards where we want to go. And so, for example, there are significant obstacles to full and fair and equal voting, from the voter disenfranchisement efforts and the unfair redistricting and gerrymandering, the influence of money in politics. It's also the case that if those of us who believe in equal justice are fully participating as voters, those of us who can vote, and through civic engagement for folks who currently can't vote, we can still achieve the transformative change that we seek, using some of the ideas that have been part of the US and international community and statement of values. If we fully implemented the human rights regime that we helped to build, the Constitution and laws that we have created, and voted those of us who can vote to elect people to office who are committed to doing so, we would have a sea change. That's not to say that we shouldn't revisit things like the Electoral College, which in many ways are structural obstacles to all of us having an equal voice. But I don't want to convey that those are necessary prerequisites to transformative change. We can have transformative change is in significant part up to us. And I think some of that change is going to have to be revisiting those big institutions and systems. Voting and the way we vote and elect people is one of them.
So let's turn our gaze now to higher education. You've mentioned it a couple of times. So how do we fundamentally reimagine higher education, taking into account this conversation? There was a recent Twitter thread with the hashtag Black in the Ivory, which some of the people in the audience may have checked out. And if you haven't, I highly recommend it, whether or not you have a Twitter account. And this thread, Black in the Ivory, highlights both the individual experiences of Black faculty members, as well as the larger challenges of systemic racism within academia. So I'm just curious, Alan, what are your thoughts in terms of what Harvard specifically, but also other elite institutions can do to address systemic racism, which has been a challenge for decades, but has really come to the surface now as every institution really is grappling with how it addresses issues of race.
So you and I were talking before we went on about Harvard College's decision to suspend its consideration that it's no longer requiring SAT and ACT scores for the class, admission to the class of 2025. And, so that's fascinating, but it's temporary. And why is it temporary? A tiny, tiny step forward would be to eliminate consideration of those standardized tests, which 2 of my students this past semester wrote about the fact that they are not predictive of either academic talent or future success, and yet they are discriminatory in practice. They exclude people based on race and ethnicity and background and income. So let's get rid of them, right? Let's make that change permanent. That would be a tiny, change in the right direction. But what if we were to, in addition to that, step back and think in a more transformative way, revisit the purpose of institutions of higher education, which are now critical to the success and mobility and economic security of people in our country and virtually around the world. What if we were to decide that that is clearly something that everyone should have access to, everyone who has the basic ability or capacity and interest should be able to have access? What if we were to decide that higher education is partly an inculcation of what we believe everyone should understand and be able to grasp in order to be fully participating citizens and voters and leaders in our society, and that understanding the fundamentals of racial discrimination in our country is crucial to understanding how our nation works and how we can move forward in a positive way. And if that were part of the core curriculum of our institution and of every other institution. Going back to this question of international human rights, what if we were to take seriously, I'm actually looking here at Article 13 of the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, which provides that higher education shall be made equally accessible to all on the basis of capacity by every appropriate means, and in particular by the progressive introduction of free education. Now, this is this idea of progressive realization that we see in the economic human rights space, which means that as a nation state is better able to provide the full range of economic and cultural and social rights, it is obligated to do so. In the United States, we have the ability to do so right now, to ensure that everyone has access, irrespective of race or ethnicity or economic station. Those are just a couple of things that would be transformative and that we know would work because of the small things that have been done, like the University of Texas, which began admitting to its flagship university anyone in the top 10% of state high schools. Because those high schools are so racially segregated, that significantly increased the diversity, racial, ethnic, and socioeconomic diversity of their incoming class, in addition to other equal opportunity and diversity programs that they have. So, we know that this can work, but we've been afraid as a society, as institutions, to fully commit to them. Now's the time to do that. If COVID is a reason to abandon the ACT and the SAT for one academic year, it's COVID and George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and global climate change and economic inequality are reasons to fundamentally revisit what institutions of higher education mean in our society, who has access, and what they learn when they get there, and who teaches them.
Terrific. So a question from the audience: what are 3 of the most important ways we can transform institutions to better accommodate America's majority minority future? I think you've touched on some of these, but if you were to say, like, here are 3 steps to take, or 3 values or principles.
Sure. So, part of it, and this is especially true for kind of nonprofit and educational institutions, is that question of revisiting the mission, right? What is our mission? What should be our mission? And what does that mean in terms of who we serve, who we employ, who leads us, all of that. A second kind of smaller question is, but still significant, is walking through all of the criteria and obstacles and pathways that your institution uses to make those decisions, to raise money, to decide who's going to be on the board of directors, if there is one, or who's going to lead the organization. How are those decisions made? Are they, for example, what role, for example, does personal relationships play? What role do they play? That, oh, I know this person and he's great, and we should bring him on. Or, well, we did some basic recruitment and, it just seems there aren't any qualified people of color because none of them applied. When historically and through human nature, those kinds of things go out through established channels, and also with a message about who is and is not qualified. So we need to revisit all of those, because we know, for example, to take that last example, that in our country and in most countries, those relationships are segregated. The people who you end up sharing a job opportunity with are going to reflect your social circles, and those social circles are still significantly segregated in our country for a variety of reasons, many of which having to do with residential segregation, but for other reasons as well. So really questioning, rather than, oh, no qualified candidates applied, questioning, what are we defining as qualifications? Who did we reach out to and how? What story did we tell about the institution we are and who we're looking for, who belongs here, which is a crucial part of the us that is transformative. And I think we see that in many institutions where they have been willing to do that, they have transformed.
So in your prior role at Opportunity Agenda, you worked on developing framing and messaging to better communicate a range of social justice concerns. So I'm wondering, based on that body of work, what do you recommend to those of us who are concerned about advancing a racial justice agenda, and in particular ensuring support for Black Lives Matter? So what are the messaging and framing that is working today, and what are things that need to be improved or thought about further?
Well, so we talk a lot about narrative, right? That word is hot right now. And part of what narrative means is the big common story rooted in shared values that influences how people make decisions and process information. And that's crucial, right? Two people can look at the same data. I might say to you, oh, in many cities in the United States, young men of color are, have a 1 out of 3 chance of being in prison or jail. And I might hear that with my narrative and experience and conclude, as I do, that there's significant discrimination in our criminal justice system, in policing and prosecutorial decisions and sentencing and the like. Someone else might hear that same data point and conclude, based on the narrative they're carrying around, oh, young men of color are more disposed to commit crime, right? And so if we're simply sharing the information about outcomes and hoping for the best, that our audiences will come to the same conclusions that we come to, we see what the outcome is, right? We're increasingly talking across each other. And so as people committed to social change, part of what narrative needs to mean for us, and part of the work that I did at the Opportunity Agenda and that the organization is still doing, is to tell the story of shared values of opportunity and equal justice and public safety, explain the ways in which those values are not being fulfilled in systemic ways, right? That the discrimination in the way communities are policed means that young men of color are more likely to get stopped, frisked, arrested. The police are, of course, more likely to find criminal conduct among Black and brown people if those are the people that they're stopping. What does that mean when it gets to the point of prosecution? What does it mean when it gets to the sentencing decision? If we're not explaining that to our audiences, then only the people who already agree with us are going to be convinced, right? We need to tell a story that activates our base and sustains our base, the people who are out in the streets demanding equal justice. And at the same time, we have to persuade the undecideds, the skeptics, who we need to be part of this common enterprise. This is a moment where we have a greater openness, a greater ability to do that than we've had in decades, maybe generations. And we need to be real about it. And so, those same segregated social circles that we have mean that we often only talk to each other in ways that only convince each other. We need to be both convincing and activating each other to go out and do more, and we need to be persuading those people who are not yet convinced. And, you know, we need to recognize we have opponents. There are people who are actively working against our vision and values, who will never be convinced, just as we'll never be convinced of their worldview. And part of our role and activity needs to be to persuade the people who are undecided of our worldview, and to expose the falsehoods and the corruption and immorality of that opposing worldview. That's not easy, but again, we have a greater ability to do that right now than we've had, you know, in a very, very long time.
So before we close, I want to ask you a fairly simple question. There's been an outpouring of interest among sort of the general public to read books on US history, in particular African-American history. And I'm wondering, are there 2 to 3 books that you would suggest that people pick up and read to learn more about the historical past, as well as recommendations for how we can build a more just society?
Well, you know, I think on this set of questions, you know, Michelle Alexander's new Jim Crow is crucial. There's a wonderful book, and I'm blanking on the author, but I'll send it, maybe we can post it, which outlines the Supreme Court's 10 worst decisions regarding Native Americans, which is really a terrific, I mean, it's a difficult read, but it's very important to understanding why the structural attempted genocide and cultural annihilation of Native Americans has occurred. And also it's a reminder that Indigenous peoples are still very much with us, despite the narrative that they're a part of history only, very much still with us, and leaders, and really making change in their communities and nationally. I'm not a book guy, despite being a law professor. So, you know, for example, I think Henry Louis Gates's series on Reconstruction is fantastic and a good primer for what we're now going through. You know, Brian Stevenson's Just Mercy, both the book and the new film, are terrific sources. So, you know, what I would say is, in addition, art and culture are crucial. They're not the same as history, right? We can't necessarily trust television or Twitter especially to school us on accurately on history, but they're an important reflection of values and vision, and especially of the world as it could be, right? One thing that is so crucial in this moment is not just to understand what's come before, but to not let our cynicism and our heartbreak about things that have happened prevent us from envisioning the nation and world that could exist. And I think consuming art and culture, you know, go see Black Panther, to be reminded of, you know, how we could proceed in a new vision that the world has not yet seen.
Thank you, Alan, so much for joining us today.
Thank you.